Hi, Professor Ellis. This is my video blog number 4. Identify and define the 4 options Mulcahy identifies for risk response planning. Provide examples. The 4 options are avoid, mitigate, transfer, and accept. In my experience, as noted by Mulcahy on page 197, mitigate is the choice that I've most often experienced. And I don't know if there's a pride issue where people think that if they're on a project and there is a risk, they have to do something to mitigate that risk. However, I think avoidance is probably the most preferred option if we can just avoid it altogether. In the few examples that I've had my own experience, risk was indeed reduced, and that included the three of the 4, which would have been avoidance, mitigation, or transfer. Acceptance, I've experienced that on occasion, and I think I'll get to that in one of the other questions. Explain the difference between contingency plan and fallback plan and provide examples when you've used each of them at work. A contingency plan is the initial plan in order to mitigate a risk. The fallback plan is when that contingency plan did not work. In my particular experience, probably most recently, I do programming using Microsoft Access, both SQL as well as VBA. I'm not as experienced in VBA, however, my desire when I get into a new project is to stretch myself a little more and get more proficient using VBA. So in a recent set of projects that I was on, the code, I chose to approach a particular project using code that would create a multi-dimensional array. I'm not that experienced with them. I've used them once in my life and maybe referred back to it one other time in my life, and those were both many years ago. But my fallback or my contingency plan was to just use SQL statements and append those to a particular table. So I would just run row by row by row and append them down to the table and then export the table out into Excel. My fallback plan would have been to then, or was to then, if I can't figure out my code and for some reason the SQL statements using Microsoft Access failed, then I would go to my IT group and plead, and beg for support on the VBA code. In this particular case, I struggled with certain elements of the multidimensional array and looping, so I went back to use my SQL, which I'm very comfortable with. However, it was so complex in my criteria that the Microsoft Access engine could not handle it. So it would throw errors that say this is too complex, which then forced me to have to go to my fallback plan and get with IT, who gave me minor coaching, and there was a few flaws with my code, and boom, it pushed me over the edge, and I was actually able to use the original mitigation plan. Explain the difference between risk response plan and a risk management plan. I believe the risk management plan is the overall plan that deals with risk, and a risk response plan then breaks down each risk and how one would respond in mitigating, avoiding, transferring, or accepting that risk. What can you recommend when the cost of risk mitigation is greater than the cost impact of the risk? My experience, which is most often the case in my own personal context, is when data integrity is problematic within our material management system, and meetings are held and we think to ourselves, if we just get our SAP programming group to come up with an enhancement to the system, this will eliminate the need for this to happen in the first place. In the meantime, I could work on maybe working with them on doing some mass updates to clean up the data or whatever. However, when we go in and start looking at how extensive this problem is, we soon learn that it's fairly limited. So spending the money on enhancing versus just manually going in and cleaning up the data and putting more effort towards training to keep it from happening instead of system enhancements to force it from happening often went out. What mitigation action did Nehemiah implement? I believe it was more transfer and mitigation. Generally speaking, he tried to mitigate the threat by coming up with solutions, but ultimately those solutions included transferring responsibility to some of the families to stand in the gap, stand in the hole areas with their swords and spears and so on. Hope that answered all the questions. God bless you and have a wonderful evening.